I pointed out in the book is that when you start to recognize that and understand what's going on, it kind of diffuses the whole process. And once you understand what your body's doing, you just say, "Oh, that's adrenaline."
I recognize that. I'll be fine.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not quite that simple, but it takes a lot of work to get there. But that's the premise anyway.
Let's talk about almost another character in the book is the newspaper business.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have Greg start out back in the days when he could be a copy boy.
Mm-hmm.
That job, I don't think, exists
No,
in
it
the
doesn't.
newspaper business any longer.
No, I was just asking somebody the other day that worked at the Star Telegram if they knew if they had copy boys anymore, and they said no, they haven't had copy boys in 25 years or something like that. So yeah, that was the old days.
Tell me about your experience in the newspaper business that you brought to this novel, because I think it's an important piece of the book.
Well, I didn't get into this in this book, but my father and two of his siblings were in journalism, and so I kind of followed the family tradition into journalism. But my dad was in TV news, and I wasn't too interested in TV news. I was more interested in print journalism and photography and photojournalism and such. So I sort of focused on that. I worked on my high school newspaper and yearbook, and in college at UTA and at North Texas, where I graduated. I worked on the school papers there. And when I graduated, well, actually, while I was still in college, I got a job as a copy boy at the Fort Worth Star Telegram. And believe me, if you want an overview of the newspaper business, a copy boy is a good place to be, because you're running errands all over the newspaper, and you get to see, what's done, what the reporters do, what the editors do, what the printers do, what the press room does, and you see the whole operation. But of course, your main job is in the newsroom, and you're working with reporters and editors. And that job just convinced me that that's what I want to do. That's the business I want to be in. And so when I graduated from North Texas, I came back to the Star Telegram as a reporter and worked there for a couple of years as a reporter. I covered the police beat, and I covered Arlington. Well, I covered a lot more than Arlington. They call it the Mid-Cities Bureau, and we covered all the suburbs between
Right.
Dallas and Fort Worth, and we covered city government and whatever was going on, out in those suburbs. And then I got this is where my life parallels Greg's. I got a job as wire editor of the Galveston Daily News, and I moved to Galveston and worked down there for a year, and it was the most fascinating place I think I've ever been. It was just a really interesting experience. But the paper was sold after about a year. The newspaper was sold, and they started cutting staff positions, and I didn't have the seniority. So I came back to the Star Telegram and worked as a copy editor for the next 7 or 8 years. And that's what I did until I left. And I'd had a background in photography as well as writing and editing. And so when I left the paper, I started my own photography business and did that for the next 25 years.
Tell me what it was about Galveston that you found so interesting.
Well, it was just like another planet. I mean, you drive across that causeway to Galveston Island, and it's just like going into a different world. It doesn't feel like you're still in Texas. It's more like, I don't know, a combination of New York City and New Orleans or something. The architecture is different. There are all these old Victorian homes with the gingerbread architecture, and
At least there were before the hurricane. We don't know if they're
right.
still
Yeah,
there.
I'd like to know how some of those fared. In some ways, it was beautiful. In some ways, it was kind of run down. And this was at a time, see, in the late 1950s, the state of Texas shut down all the gambling and vice and everything that was in Galveston. And it was kind of in the aftermath of all that I lived there, and there were parts of Galveston that were kind of depressing, that were really kind of sad. They let a lot of the old historic buildings run down and that sort of thing. So and then later in the 70s and 80s, they did a lot of restoration and you know, restored a lot of the old historic buildings along the wharves and such. And it's a much nicer, or has been up until Hurricane Ike, it's been a much nicer place than it was when I was there. But it was, the people there are the strangest people. And this has been written about. Gary Cartwright, who wrote for Texas Monthly as well as local newspapers, wrote a book about Galveston, and he talks about how Galvestonians refer to themselves, and there's an abbreviation called BOI, which means Born on Island, and if you are not BOI, they don't recognize your existence. And you know, I was there from Fort Worth, and a stranger, and the, you know, the people, the shopkeepers and so forth, kind of treat you like you something wrong, you know,
Outsider.
like outsiders. Yeah, you feel very much like an outsider.
I wonder if that's still prevalent down there today.
I think to a lesser extent it is, but I think, you know, since tourism is there, apparently you know, the fact that a lot of tourists come to Galveston is fed into that attitude a lot, but I think they've opened up a little bit in recent years. I've been back many times since I lived there, but it's a fascinating place. And our newspaper, the Galveston News, was in this old building, which I think was built in the 1880s or something like that, and it was just an anachronism. I mean, it was just, you know, like something out of the early days. It was just, they moved into a new building while I was there, but that building is still there, and it's been restored and still looks like it did when I was there. But there were several families in Galveston who basically ran things, and they were the power, the money and the power of Galveston. And as I point out in the book, there's a guy who's a member of a very prominent family who gets special treatment from the police and everything, even though he's committed a crime. And that was one of the conflicts when I worked there. Was, see, this family had owned the Galveston paper, but they had sold it to the Houston Post, and the power families in Galveston were not used to. They hated. Another thing about Galveston people is they hate Houston, and to have the Houston newspaper owning their paper just did not go over well. And the guy from the rich family who had committed a crime, you know, he expected to be treated the way he had always been before, but the paper's new editors didn't want to follow that path, so they, you know, made it a point to go after him and expose him. So
you have some danger associated with newspaper work in
yes,
this novel.
Yeah.
Is that real? Is there really danger associated with being in the news business?
Not usually.
But sometimes.
But sometimes there can be, when you have a volatile situation and a half crazy character like Lester Hastings is. You know, it could happen. And in a smaller town like Galveston, it's probably less likely to happen in Fort Worth. But yeah, he, or at least we think, that Hastings engineers harassment of some of the newspaper people, including Greg. Throwing bricks through the window and, you know, things like that, slashing tires and such.
Well, we're glad you came back to
Yeah.
to Dallas and Arlington and Fort Worth.
I hasten to point out that whole episode was fictional. Nothing like that happened.
Darn! There was no James Bond stuff going on.
Not really. No.
You said Greg's girlfriend's name is Susie.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Susie is a much more tolerant young lady than I think I would be.
I think so, yes.
Greg stops calling her 2 or 3 or 4 different times in the novel, and she always takes him back. She always takes him back.
Yeah.
Where did the idea for the character of Susie come from?
Susie, it is a composite of a number of girls that I've known or dated or married.
Yeah, his wife is sitting here in the studio, by the way.
Her personality and looks are based on a girl that I dated right after high school.